The voice of one crying out in the wilderness. The voice of one in the desert crying out. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness. The voice of one in the desert crying out. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness. The voice of one in the desert crying out. Prepare the way of the Lord.
All right. Hey, friends, this is Stephen Black, your host with Freedom Realized Live every week, where we are bringing to you bold truth, bold courage, and bold compassion. Today is the same thing, but a little bit of a different bold compassion in that we're going to be talking about some legal stuff concerning the Equality Act. And in context of what we talked about last week concerning the God's voice, I wanted to go ahead and interject having a guest on today, Chris Sevier, concerning what we mentioned last week about suing the President of the United States and the proponents of this thing called the Equality Act. And some of you may or may not know what that means, and we're going to unpack that here in a minute. But for our bold truth today, I want to go to 2 Timothy. It's a familiar passage of Scripture to those who have been tuning in. Chapter 3, very pertinent, again, to what we talked about last week, having MD Perkins on, and this week, and the need for the God's Voice Conference. We are living in, like it says here, if we can, let's go to 2 Timothy chapter 3. It says at the top here in this passage of Scripture, perilous times and perilous men. Starting here, it says, but know this, that in the last days, now those who study eschatology realize that even in the first century Christianity, they thought it was the last days then. How much more so now, 2,000 years later? They said it was the last hour. I think we are in the last seconds before the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. It said there would be perilous times, that these perilous times are coming with the idea, verse 2, that men would be lovers of self. And this is selfish indulgence, selfish ambition, selfish pleasures. Because of the love of money, men are filled with boasting and proudfulness, arrogance, blasphemer, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control. And boy, I was on a meeting with a pastor this week from the East Coast, and going to be going to Philadelphia to do a pretty large conference with Bucks Community Church in Bucks County. And the pastor there was telling me about some of the stuff that was going on in the school system there. And we're seeing it all over the country, where there is this idea of, really because of the lack of self-control, that our children, in the 90s and even, as much as the beginning of this century, 2000, was this removal of abstinence education and the idea of promoting, we need to get condoms, we need STD testing in our junior high and high schools. This is the level of a lack of self-control. But now, in the last 10 years, transmania, or what is this transgenderism, and this really kind of like this bulldozing of the lack of self-control in the area of people with mental illness and anxiety disorders, and really some really diabolical things with the willingness to inject hormones into even prepubescent kids, and then removal of healthy breast tissue. It is without self-control. And then it goes on to say here, brutal. You know the word brutal? I mean, I don't know how more brutal you can get in the medical community, wanting to propagate this idea of having 13-year-old, 14-year-old girls having their healthy breast tissue removed. This is diabolical on so many levels. And then they're despisers of good. And we would have never thought, in this country, there would actually be a literal despising of Christianity. And yet that's where we are today. And you have Disney, we talked about it last week. Walt Disney created an environment would be a beautiful place for children to have healthy imagination and fantasy and wonder and bliss. But now you've got the LGBTQ at the top levels, sexual perversion going on in Disney, where somebody sent me this icon of Minnie Mouse, and in her bow, they actually created like a phallic symbol. And you can't make some of this stuff up with what's going on with Disney and embedded things and now in their movies that are honestly very provocative and even a subliminal message to the minds of children. This is so brutal and despising of good. And then in that, of course, we have betrayal and traitors, like we see in the church at large, that you have now this new movement, the revoicing movement, and people wanting to promote LGBTQ plus sign Christianity, and they're calling it sexual minorities, headstrong, not listening to sound reason, and then, of course, haughty. And we're getting ready to go into Gay Pride Month. I don't know what it'll be like. Last year, because of coming out of COVID, was one of the most debaucherous that we've seen in the streets of our country. It'll be interesting to see what Gay Pride looks like in the streets of this country this year, where you literally had down in Key West, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, where you literally have people having orgy-like activity in the open. And in San Francisco, the police kind of rope the area off, and they don't even look. And this is such full of lovers of perversion, lovers of pleasure, and all of this is culminating in lovers of such self-indulgence that it really is akin to what the scripture has called debauchery. That is not at all inflating what's actually taking place. So if this is going on, where are the bold, courageous people making a choice to take a stand? I mean, I'm a grandparent now, and I have a 10-year-old grandson, and I want him protected from this ugliness. And yet he's telling me, and he's homeschooled, and he's telling me at this event that this girl came up to him and said that she was non-binary and that her friend was a lesbian. And I'm like, I can't even protect my 10-year-old grandson. uh, and even in homeschooled environments. They are coming at the kids at every single place. I was in Michigan, of all things, at a Reformed church that does 80% homeschooling, 10% Christian schools, and the other 10% were in public school. In this, over 250 students at a sing-along where they sing Christmas hymns right before Christmas. And we did this Q&A, and the questions that came in from that group were mind-boggling in dealing with all forms of sexual sin and brokenness. And this is supposed to be the cream of the crop of children who are in conservative environments. Folks, this is why we need to take a stand. And I'm asking you, what are you doing to take a stand? You know, every week we talk about being courageous. We encourage here with the scripture, because it goes on to say, and let me wrap this up. It goes on to say that they are lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, because there's a lot of people that have a form of godliness. They don't have an actual intimate daily devotion and worship of Jesus Christ. And what they do is they deny the power, especially denying the power of being able to change to where the grace of God comes in, realigns the inner thinking, feelings, and desires of a person. This movement of the revoicers in the Presbyterian Church of America, now the Southern Baptists. You know, you got J.D. Greer doing the gay dance, patting his, gay staff member who was on Grindr. This kind of stuff is just rampant. And what we need, of course, is hitting our knees in prayer and interceding. But we also need to be proclaiming the truth. And we also need to take the fight to places that are actually coming against our entire way of thinking and living with this LGBTQ craziness. So that's what we're looking at here today in the gay news, and the importance of understanding what are we really up against when these people want to come in and turn the grace of God into the lasciviousness. So, Disney, you got Ron DeSantis having to, like we showed last week, having to confront these reporters, lying about the bill in Florida. They're calling it, the Don't Say Gay, which is ridiculous. It's not even in the bill. And so this is a big problem. So to understand some of the Equality Act, I've got a couple of video clips before we bring Chris on. And this is understanding. It's called, it was passed through the House. It's already passed. It's called H.R. 5. And this is the truth, a video, the truth about the Equality Act. Joshua, let's roll it.
Parents in Ohio recently lost custody of their 17-year-old daughter because they declined to put her on testosterone supplements. And a Catholic hospital in Washington settled out of court when the ACLU sued them for declining to perform a double mastectomy on a gender dysphoric 16-year-old girl. New medical guidelines are being pushed by activists across the country. They include encouraging social transitions in children as young as 4 years old, providing puberty-blocking drugs to children as young as 11, cross-sex hormones at 16, and sex reassignment surgery at 18. These are just a few examples of the ways in which H.R. 5, or the Equality Act, would empower the federal government to punish citizens and medical professionals who disagree with sexual orientation and gender identity ideology. As a parent or a doctor, shouldn't you be able to make choices according to your child or patient's best interest? That's not how it would work under the Equality Act. We all agree that no one should be discriminated against simply because they're gay or transgender. And every person should have the dignity and respect of their fellow citizens and the law. But unfortunately, that's not happening. And examples in which others' rights are being violated are underreported. Here are a few more. In Georgia, Pasha Thomas was forced to remove her 5-year-old daughter from a school after a male classmate assaulted her in the girls' restroom. In an Alaskan homeless shelter for women who have already experienced domestic violence, sex trafficking, and sexual assault, and are afraid of biological men being allowed in their private spaces, a biological male tried to forcefully gain access to the city's downtown Hope Center. The individual has now sued the center for alleged gender identity discrimination. And in Philadelphia, just days after the city put out an urgent call for 300 additional families to foster children, the city halted child placements by Catholic Social Services because of the organization's belief that children deserve both a mother and a father. These examples are just the tip of the iceberg. A federal sexual orientation and gender identity law would empower the government to interfere in how Americans live their lives every day. And any bill promoting such authoritarianism is a danger to our freedoms.
So that was from the Heritage Foundation, and what they didn't mention, but they're wanting to amend the 1964 Civil Rights Status, basically making all of these LGBTQ plus sign, pay attention to that plus sign, folks, because that's MAPS and YAPS, minor attractive people, youth attractive people, pedophiles, having being equal to somebody's race and somebody's sex, gender. And they want to push this into insurance, housing, employment, every education system in the United States. The demand that you must bow down and accept LGBTQ. And folks, I'm going to call it what it is. It's a cult. It's a cult religion based in secular humanism to destroy the way that we live and believe. And it is a direct assault on the Christian church. And if you haven't paid attention, you need to, and you need to get your voice heard. Let's roll the next clip, please.
Under the Equality Act, disagreement is discrimination. It includes gay marriage, men competing in women's sports, and doctors performing procedures like gender reassignments that go against their conscience. It's a bill the president wants to sign into law during his first 100 days. The Equality Act provides long overdue federal civil rights protections for LGBTQ plus Americans, preventing discrimination in our housing, education, public services, and lending systems, the president tweeted. But the bill does much more.
We can see that it would immediately be stripping religious Americans and stripping girls and women of our equal rights.
By redefining sex discrimination, the measure would provide for abortion on demand, likely end a long-standing prohibition on taxpayer-funded abortions, and remove conscience protections for doctors and nurses. Biological men would be allowed to compete in women's sports, effectively obliterating Title IX, while girls and women would be forced to share locker rooms and bathrooms in schools and public places. Harley says we don't have to guess about the results. Just look at cities and states that have already passed similar laws.
In Alaska, the city of Anchorage had a law like this and punished a faith-based homeless shelter for battered women and actually forced them to allow biological men who identified as women to sleep and change clothes alongside these women, most of whom were victims of rape and sex trafficking.
She says the Equality Act allows for subjectivity, an issue Senator James Lankford raised last summer on the Senate floor.
If I go to interview in a job and I'm not hired, I can sue that employer because I perceive they were thinking I was gay, and so they didn't hire me. I don't have to prove anything. It's based simply on my perception or belief.
Under the bill, Christian beliefs are unlawful. Churches could be prevented from requiring employees to abide by their biblical beliefs about marriage and differences between men and women. Alliance Defending Freedom is litigating a case in Virginia, a state that recently passed a law like the Equality Act.
Churches are banned from having a dress code. having a code of conduct for their employees, even asking in interviews if potential employees share core religious beliefs.
Harley and others opposed to the legislation say tolerance must be a two-way street.
I think the Equality Act treats people of faith as second-class citizens. It specifies a certain point of view and it labels it as bigotry.
And Gordon, as you mentioned, the Equality Act is expected to be acted on in the House today, where it's expected to pass overwhelmingly. Then it heads to the Senate, where its future is a bit more uncertain.
Well, Jennifer, I'm kind of surprised to hear the prediction that it's going to pass overwhelmingly in the House. Are Republicans going to vote for this in the House? And if so, does that mean it will pass the Senate?
Well, when this passed, this was introduced in the House last year, and it passed the House last year. Last year, a number of Republicans, if I remember correctly, I think 8 supported it in the House. In the Senate, it looks like it's a bit different. We have already seen, so last year when this was introduced in the House, Susan Collins, who is a Republican from Maine serving in the U.S. Senate, she served as the lone Republican co-sponsor on the Senate side. This time around, she says that she is not going to co-sponsor the legislation. Whether that means she would vote on it in final passage, that remains unclear. We also know that Senator Mitt Romney has said that he will not support this, citing concerns over religious freedom. And we don't think that any other Republicans are going to support it. We also know that at least one Democrat in the Senate, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, has said that he has some problems with the legislation as written. So right now, again, it looks like it could stall in the Senate. But Gordon, make no mistake, this is something that Senator Chuck Schumer really wants to get done. This is something that he wants to do for his base. This is something President Biden wants to get done for his base. And I think, from Chuck Schumer's perspective, he realizes that Democrats may not be in control of the Senate. They may not be in control of the House in 2 years. And so they feel like this is really an opportunity to get it done. And I think we've already seen, I've seen some reports of senators saying that they're going to be really working their Republican colleagues very hard on in the Senate to try and convince them that they should vote yes on this legislation.
Well, the base includes Christians, includes Mormons, includes Muslims, includes Orthodox Jews. It includes all of that. Why isn't there a religious exemption in here? The Constitution spells out that Congress shall pass no law respecting the freedom of religion. So, or prohibiting the free exercise. So why in the world would they not have a religious exemption?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that's the problem that people who have problems with this cite. They say it is counter to the Constitution. It prohibits people of faith, all the faiths that you just mentioned, from exercising their constitutional rights. And so I know that Congressman Chris Stewart from Utah is planning to introduce some legislation he also introduced last year, which is the Fairness for All Act, which attempts to amend the Equality Act in a way to allow for protections for people of faith. Now, some people say that doesn't go far enough.
So I wanted you to see some of this, but here's the thing, and bringing in Chris, I want to bring Chris in now, but before we do, the sanctity of the church depends on real believers in the church contending for the faith in Christ. There's that graphic that we usually pull up. By living holy lives, you never stop preaching the gospel. You are contending for the faith. And I met Chris a few years ago in dealing with the need to get legislation passed, and actually Oklahoma may be the first state to pass a pro counseling protection bill. We're getting ready to see if it goes to vote before June. But the sanctity of the church depends on this, and that means you being courageously bold. And that's why I like Jude's verse here. It says, "Beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, our common salvation to do something. And that word contend means to fight. You're fighting for this faith. And yet we have people that just want to just lay back and let the government ride right over us and, have men who are dressed up like women or, hormonally or surgically changed to take showers with women or go to the bathrooms with our daughters. I mean, this stuff is crazy. But then we saw January 6th in Canada pass the law of an anti-conversion therapy to where it makes it what I'm even doing right now, a 5-year criminal felony to proclaim the truth about these issues. This broadcast right now could land me in prison in Canada. And so that's what's happening. Very important. There's a little graphic here. Bold courage is to merely, this is just basic, common sense truth of XX and XY, men and women made in the image of God, is now considered hate speech. And that's what the Equality Act would do. This is as basic as it gets, but this is what the LGBTQ advocates. So, Chris, if you would join me, we have Chris Sevier on. Can you hear me? Are you hearing him?
Oh, yeah.
Are you here?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay, good, Chris. So, Chris, first off, why on earth would you even want to get involved in this? Tell us from your perspective, why are you being boldly courageous about this?
Silence in the face of evil is to cooperate with it. And in the instant case, the government's endorsement and entanglement with the LGBTQ cult is incredibly evil. It's promoting licentiousness. It's eroding community standards of decency. It's creating confusion, division. And so for a litany of reasons, but the main reason is because, I have the skills to fight back, and I'm just acting in the lane that I know that I have the opportunity to act in to stop something that I think is immensely immoral, and also to restore the rule of law and to get the United States is a constitutional republic, and we want the Constitution to be the controlling authority of our country. And I'm engaging in different activity to ensure that that's the case.
So your bone in this fight is just because you're a Christian, you want what's right.
So I am a Christian. I want what's right, but I want the government to comply with the United States Constitution. And the government is not complying with it by creating and promoting and attempting to enact and enforce policies that respect, endorse, and favor LGBTQ ideology because of the principles, because of the Establishment Clause violations that are implicated in that. It violates the principles of separation of church and state. So,
because it really is a religion, isn't it?
Yeah, we make this argument in the complaint. We said we define what religion is. What is religion according to the legal definitions that the courts have used in the past, and what do the theologians say that religion is? And religion is just a set of answers to the unproven questions, the great questions, like why are we here? What should we be doing as humans, and what happens after death? And the LGBTQ cult is organized, it's full, it provides a comprehensive code by which its members can guide their daily lives by. It's a closed system, and for all of these different reasons, it meets the legal definition of a religion. Instead of having the cross or the star and crescent or the 10 commandments, they have the rainbow colored flag. And so for all of these different reasons, LGBTQ ideology is just nothing more than a series of unproven faith-based assumptions and naked assertions that are implicitly religious and inseparably linked to the religion of secular humanism.
Yeah, so it really is a faith. It's a faith in themselves.
Right.
And so the idea, there's some kind of background noise. Are you hearing that, Justin?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you get that clear. But they're really wanting to promote secular humanism, which it makes man God.
Absolutely. It's basically people are using our government to convert it into their own private church. They are looking for affirmation. They're looking for a savior. They're looking for a redeemer, but the government's not supposed to be that. So me as a Christian, I don't want the government to impose Christianity on everyone, just like I don't want them to impose, moral relativism secular humanism as advocated by the licentious LGBTQ cult for the same reason. Government's supposed to be neutral. Government's not a savior. And so they basically, a bunch of people that feel inadequate and shameful about conduct that naturally produces those feelings. And they're looking for the government to affirm them, to say, it's okay, you can engage in that. And the government's not supposed to do that. If anything, the government's supposed to uphold community standards of decency and enact policies that, number one, discourage licentiousness, and number two, enjoin or prevent practices that conduct that attempt to justify practices that are inconsistent with the peace and safety of the state.
Yeah, that's well said, Chris. So we have this situation that you've put together along with a group of people. And I think this is very important to announce and even to do a press release on. And that is that we, I say we, mainly you, but certainly a group of us are plaintiffs to swear on the truth of what has happened in our own lives. Of course, with me personally, swearing to the fact that a survey that we conducted and over 30 years of ministry is real, in that people have left LGBTQ plus sign mentality and lifestyles behind. So it is changeable. It's not immutable, which really the qualification for the Equality Act is based upon immutability and as the civil rights status. And so, Chris, what have we done? What did you pull together? What are we getting ready to do?
So I am one of 6 plaintiffs, and you're a plaintiff. Dr. David Pickup is a plaintiff. He used to be self-identified as a homosexual, left it behind. Now he's kind of doing conversion therapy, different things.
Right.
You have Greg Quinlan.
It's not conversion therapy. He's just doing good therapy.
Well, I think you called it pastoral care, is what it's called.
And that's what we call it. But he is doing the new applied reparative therapy from Dr. Joseph Nicolosi. But even when you look at that, it's good talk therapy.
Amen.
And that's
Absolutely.
what David Pickup does.
I will be sure to use that in court and call it the.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to call it conversion therapy.
Right. I mean, that's
what the liars call it.
Fair enough. Just like the same thing as when they always talk about, is the person gay? Are they homosexual? Are they transgender? I'm always going, there's no such thing as a homosexual or transgender. There's just some people who self-identify as a homosexual or transgender for some period of time, which they can, pursuant to the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment or the Free Speech Clause. But that's not a real thing. Like there's a black person or a white person or an Asian person or whatever. That's predicated on immutability and genetics. There's a difference with the distinction. So back to, you may answer what we're doing. Let me go back to your question.
Yeah. The law. What I think it's called a lawsuit.
It's called a lawsuit. So you got Greg Quinlan. He's the executive director for Center for Garden State Families. You have Darren Mell, who's the president for Voice of the Voiceless. You have Pastor Pinkoski, and then you have me, the former Judge Advocate General. And the 6 of us have sued President Biden, as well as Representative Cicilline, Chuck Schumer, and some other members of Congress. The prime sponsor in the Senate, Merkley, and Nancy Pelosi, and some others that have created and introduced this measure, which is kind of the kitchen sink measure for all things LGBTQ. They get everything they've always wanted in all in one bill, which I actually like, because then you can really test whether or not it's valid. Any of those policy ideas are valid. And so we've sued them in federal district court in the District of Columbia. The case has been assigned to Judge McFadden. The case is brought pursuant to what's called 42 U.S.C. 1983. It's a case to say that we believe that our civil rights are being violated. And we believe that the government, the defendants in this case, are violating primarily the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Because when they introduce this bill and they're threatening to enact it and enforce it, what they're doing is they're failing what's called the 3 prongs of a lemon test. And that's the test the courts use to determine whether or not government action violates the Establishment Clause. But what it means in English is they've engaged in conduct that creates the perception for the reasonable observer that America is under the thumb of secular humanism, that that they're endorsing and excessively entangling our government with one religious worldview. And so again, as a Christian, we're all Christians, plaintiffs, And we're saying we believe that Jesus is exactly who he said he was. And we believe that that's a set of truth claims that will lead to an immense amount of human flourishing. However, we're not here to get the government to promote our worldview. We want the government to be neutral. We want it to be, let people decide for themselves, if you will. And so, yet the lawsuit is filed. I've been talking to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We've got a decent working relationship with them, and we're going to go figure out exactly how, the time schedule of when to move forward. But we're gonna hit them pretty hard. And Judge McFadden is a really good judge. He's very fair. I've had other cases before him, and we're hopefully the U.S. Attorney's Office and us will lay out all the arguments in the record, and then see what Judge McFadden does.
So we are going to sue President Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer.
So we have sued them. The lawsuit is active and alive.
Yeah.
We're about to file a motion for permanent injunction. I mean, and really quick, the overview of the lawsuit would say that, back to earlier things we were talking about, when someone says that they were born in the wrong body, that they were born with gay genes, okay, that's not an argument. That's a negative assertion. It takes a lot of faith to believe that that's true.
It is a statement, isn't it?
Right. And so the Supreme...
No science behind that.
Right. So they would say that, basically what we have is that they were born the Supreme Court of the United States in Torcaso versus Watkins and other cases have found that secular humanism is a religion for the purpose of the First Amendment. So what does that mean in English? It means the Supreme Court's already found that it is a religious worldview that does warrant some protections. You can believe in it and so forth. Some of the practices can be regulated, but it also means that the government can't endorse it, that it can't favor it, that it can't get in bed with it, excessively entangle itself with it. Violates the principles of separation of church and state. So what we have is we have 4 different groups providing sworn statements into the record, which they're already basically all filed. And those 4 groups where we have medical experts like Dr. Taylor King, Dr. Cortella, we have former self-identified homosexual activists, if you will, or people who live the lifestyle, who've left it behind testifying. We have theologians testifying to the fact that secular humanism is a religion and so forth, that LGBTQ stems from that. And then we have testimonies from persecuted Christians. And the combination of that testimony shows that the LGBTQ sexual orientation, gender identity, that those are an ideology. They're a dogma. They're a doctrine that's inseparably linked to the religion of secular humanism. And so by tying that together with the evidence and everything, the sworn statements, we're basically saying, therefore, all of the policies that promote LGBTQ ideology it should be rendered immediately unconstitutional and invalid and unenforceable. This means no more bathroom law policies, no more women participating in girls' sport, men participating in women's sports out of respect for their religious worldview. No more, changing of birth certificates. Actually, gay marriage policies are also invalid, and for the same reason that polygamy is invalid. And any LGBTQ policy like that, forcing doctors to provide transgender surgeries, stopping good therapy, if you will, all of those policies are unconstitutional now, and they've always been since the inception of our country. So we're weaponizing authority. We have Supreme Court precedent, Torcaso versus Watkins. We're using the Lemon test analysis, which is a test that we go through this analysis about how, those LGBTQ policies fail these prongs that therefore violate the Establishment Clause. And those prongs would be, they, number one, lack a primary secular purpose. They don't accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, peace, tolerance, and unity. Number two, they cultivate indefensible legal weapons against non-observers of the religion of secular humanism. And number three, they serve to excessively entangle the government with the religion of secular humanism. So, the United States is a constitutional republic. We are not a common sense republic. That means that we're governed by the federal Constitution, and the Constitution has the First Amendment Establishment Clause. And the state and federal government are required to obey that provision of the Constitution. And by attempting to enact, by attempting to enforce the Equality Act and all similar measures like that, it fails the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment and is unconstitutional. And therefore, we're before the federal court of the United States, which is a check and balance, the Article 3 branch, asking for a permanent injunction to stop those kind of policies from going forward. And the implication of all of that is if the Equality Act is unconstitutional, and it is, that means all of the other pro-LGBTQ policies are also unconstitutional. So that's a very quick and crude overview of the fight that it's going on right now in federal district court.
Well, that is well said, and now that needs to be put in writing, and we need to get this in the news. People need to understand that this is a really, I think, cutting edge, very succinct, and very sharp way of addressing this. Now, people, I know I've got lots of friends that will say, the whole thing, the idea of the separation of church and state, and Chris, I know you've dealt with this argument as well. It's like, why are you coming at it from that angle when that's not even in the Constitution? And that was based upon, Jefferson's writing and letters. The idea is that Christianity really was supposed to be the thought and belief system that was behind the Constitution. Of course, I would argue with them. Yes, that's part of our history, but there've been some rulings, right, Chris, that has set a precedent. So for those that would be naysayers concerning the idea, don't come at it from the angle of separation of church and state. Well, the reality is that train has already gone down the tracks.
Well,
explain to our listeners.
So basically, without faith, there's no basis for morality, and without morality, there's no basis for law, and there's no way to get around that. The ultimate fight always is America a Christian nation, or is America a secular humanist nation? And the idea that separation of church and state is not part of the Constitution is not really true. It is embodied in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And the answer to the question, is America a Christian nation, as the Supreme Court found in Holy Cross versus Trinity, or is America a secular humanist nation, as Justice Kennedy stated in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, when he said, at the heart of liberty is man's ability to define his own meaning of the universe, which is exactly what this means. Basically, what that means is to each his own, which is what the sign of a Buchenwald concentration camp read. So back to the question, what are we? And the answer to that is America is unofficially a Christian nation, and that our laws can parallel Christian principles, but we do not mandate Christianity. And here's why. Because it would produce the very legalism that Christ himself was so adamantly opposed to, which is, once again, a Christian concept in and of itself. The government's not a savior, but the government should have laws that make the objectively moral choice, the objectively healthy choice, the easy choice. And it just is a fact that LGBTQ ideology is religious in nature, and that they are a cult, that they are organized, that they are full, that they have an identity, just like I have an identity as a Christ follower. They have their own identity, and they have their own belief systems that are guiding them. And, it takes a lot of faith to believe things like a man can marry a man and that man is his wife and so forth like that. And that's somehow not immoral, when everyone knows it's self-evident that it is immoral, that it does promote licentiousness, and that, the government has a compelling interest to uphold community standards of decency. And that's another way to attack it. And we do attack it from that angle as well. I mean, that's why polygamy is a crime. And it's because while polygamy is religious in nature and it's a religious belief system, and it can be protected, the idea the government can make it a crime because it promotes licentiousness. It's the same thing with LGBTQ activity. It's just the LGBTQ group has a louder voice. And
well, in many states, sodomy has been a crime and still is, and I think in the state of Oklahoma. And the medical evidence and even the really good psychological evidence is on our side on fact. That we know that in lesbianism, it has a much higher disproportionate rate of anxiety disorders and even violence in those the women who engage in long-term lesbianism, that they also deal with mental dysfunction. And
Absolutely.
So true in transgenderism. It's the highest demographic of 41%. Even in Scandinavian countries that have acceptance, and 19% more likely than any other demographic to actually commit suicide. And in the male homosexuality, the CDC stats from a medical perspective reveal that this behavior is very destructive and destructive to our culture, and even an assault on children. There's so many layers of this. Now, we didn't even get into the medical part of it in the filing of this, but the evidence is overwhelming on our side, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely lard the record with all the evidence to say that the medical science is in our favor, that they're just like there's no proof of a rape gene, there's no proof of a gay gene either. And there's all of these studies.
I cited the genome-wide associative study.
Yeah, and you provided all of that stuff, and there's so much that it's all in the record. And the only way for the defendant, I don't care if it's President Joe Biden, for him to combat that, he's got to bring in expert witnesses to combat that. And I suspect they will, and they'll bring in, the kind of expert scientists that would testify back in the day that on behalf of tobacco companies that smoking cigarettes was good for you. They'll bring in their own scientists, people who say there is proof of a gay gene. According to if you squint narrowly and you twist these things, you can see that there is. And so the point I'm making to the court is we have all the evidence to show that there's no proof of a gay gene. And oh, by the way, 4 of the plaintiffs used to live that lifestyle and they've left it behind. So are you saying they don't exist? So their existence alone is proof positive that the idea that there is a gay gene is implausible. Number one. Number two, the main thing we're saying is, okay, fine. We say that there is no gay gene. They say that there is, but we're not here to prove or disprove whether or not there's a gay gene or not. We're here to say that it's not proven and therefore is a matter of religious faith, which means the Establishment Clause is a vote, which means that the government must get out of it, which means that the Equality Act and all of its provisions and every single policy that is like that's existing now, every one of those policies is unconstitutional on the basis of the arguments that we're making as directed to the mothership, if you will, the Equality Act.
Yeah, well said. Also, I submitted my book and also the report that has the detailed comments and information of the results of the First Stone Ministries effectiveness survey. There are 16 other leaders with over 20 years of experience that also testify in just this book that was also submitted with my sworn declaration. And I read over Darren Mails. He submitted other evidence. There's a possibility. I mean, if this was to really get drawn out, couldn't we subpoena all kinds of other testimonies on our side and fill the courtroom with literally hundreds of testimonies and say, Your Honor, here's the evidence?
Yes. And so something you were saying earlier about being bold and a call to action and being responsiveness and doing something. So one thing I've got is 2 calls to action. And this will address your question. Number one, if someone's listening, they want to do something, they don't know what to do, but they want to get involved. I would ask them to go to specialforcesofliberty.com, go to the legislation by state.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, if you would, Joshua, pull up his website. What is it called?
It's specialforcesofliberty.com. And go to the website, look up under their state, whether it's Oklahoma, Texas, wherever it might be, and download the bills, the proposed bill language for your state, and send it to your members of your House, the Senate and House members on the state legislative level. They're really accessible. And send it to them and call them and get it to them and say that you live in that state and that you want that to become law. We have bills that will get rid of all the LGBTQ policies, get rid of critical race, stop social media censorship, all kinds of things there. We have the School Establishment Clause Act, which is like with the Don't Say Gay bill, so-called Don't Say Gay bill from Florida, was derived from it. But again, it's all about how you frame all this stuff. There's decisions in Obergefell, Windsor, and Bostick that constitute existing precedent. And we want these framed in a certain the language we have was written out of the wake of litigation to where they're framed in a way that if your listeners would download it and get their members to draft and enact the bills and the governor signed it into law, then they would survive in court. We would substantially solve this problem. So that's a call to action. Now, another thing they can do is they can consider looking at the lawsuit that we filed and getting lawyers to look at it. It's a 1983 case, 42 U.S.C. 1983, which means if a lawyer files this kind of case and they prevail, they can get attorney's fees, which means they wouldn't have to necessarily hire them. But if someone wants to fight back in this area, they could prospectively get a copy of our lawsuit, use it as a model template to file lawsuits of their own to challenge any policy that's like the Equality Act, any pro-LGBTQ policy. And in doing that, then they could use the sworn statements that we filed already. And I would love it if they got their own sworn statements and filed them as well. And we just started collecting statement after statement and putting it into the record. Because this is not, and so that's a long answer to your question. Should we collect these statements, so to speak? And we should collect them, and we should file them in court and file them in ways where the government has to deal with it. It's not just like writing an article and putting it out there, which the government can ignore. No, we're in federal district court right now. We've sued the defendants for very serious constitutional violations. And, we're getting this stuff into evidence. And so yes, to answer your question, it would be great to compile as many testimonies as possible and just throw them constantly at the government. And here's something else as well. People who self-identify as homosexual and lesbian, very obviously, we don't hate that person. We think that their ideology is rude and destructive and vile and terrible and bad for them and bad for everybody, bad for their future. But one of the messages from the litigation, and it's really provided by us, you, Greg, David, Darren, is that if people maybe got seduced or suckered into that worldview, that they too can leave it behind and find freedom and restoration in a different worldview, and that's possible if they want to. We definitely
no one's forcing them.
No one's, because even Christianity, it's a free gift. It stands on its own. Christianity does not live or die based off whether the government endorses it. However, LGBTQ secular humanism, without the government's stamp of approval, really implodes on its own because it's so self-evidently immoral. So this is why when we sue a public library for hosting drag queen story time at the public library, I'm in court going, Your Honor, listen, I'm a Christian. We don't want Christian Bible study taught for children in the center of the public library, but we certainly don't want the drag queen story time being taught there either. If they want to go to the if they want to go to the private Starbucks and have it, well, we would oppose it in spirit, but we wouldn't oppose it on a basis of law, a federal constitutional violation, because that's taking the government out of it. It's taking taxpayer dollars out of it. There could be other violations, obscenity code violations, but that's a totally different kind of fight and a different way, a different jurisdiction and so forth. And so, once again, we just want the government to be neutral, but, the reason why they fight back so hard is saying, no, we wanted to have it in the government building is because if you take the government's endorsement off of it and then it's off on its own at a private place, then there could be open to all kinds of violations of obscenity codes and things it opens the door for all kinds of liability because, again, on its face, it's immoral, self-evidently. So anyway.
All right. So in wrapping up, Chris, when do you think that this will actually be heard, or do you have a feel for that?
So when you file a case like this, it's a big deal. It puts a lot of pressure on the courts. The Article 3 branch is supposed to be the weakest branch. We're basically asking the court to make law, and we're asking them to make law and making the decision by interpreting the Constitution, which has the effect of making law. And we're asking the court to, in a single instance, invalidate every single solitary pro-gay policy. The COTA statute in Colorado that Jack Phillips has been persecuted under for forever, that would be invalidated. Every single solitary one of these laws should be invalidated. So I know the court's going to be a little, in the court's defense, might be a little squeamish to, in a single stroke of the pen, do that. But we're going to lean into them, and we're going to hopefully we're going to get I have a feeling this court has a lot of respect for what we're doing, for your testimony, for the testimony of others, the things that the constitutional questions we've raised are very serious. And I think they're going to let us fully put on the case, and we're going to let the other side, put on their case as well. I'm talking to the U.S. Attorney's Office this week. I'm like, look, I know you guys are busy, and we're gonna work with you as long as the chairman of the judiciary, Dick Durbin, who's Senator Durbin, who's a defendant in the case, as long as he doesn't quickly move to try to ram through the Equality Act, then we'll give them time to respond, and because we want all the evidence there. And then we want the court, hopefully we will persuade the court that the Establishment Clause has exclusive jurisdiction over these questions, that the 14th Amendment, which has two parts, the Substantive Due Process Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, has nothing to do with sexual orientation and gender identity. Okay, those
okay, so this it may be months before we get a hearing, or
yeah, it's going to be months. It's going to be months before we have to file the motion for permanent injunction. That probably should happen probably next week, I'm thinking. And then we have to serve all the defendants. They're not served yet, although they're aware of the case. I've made their attorneys aware of it. And we have to serve them. And then there probably will be some kind of case management conference, and we'll set a schedule, and hopefully before the election in November.
Okay, that would be helpful. All right, well, we're running out of time. We have to wrap this up. But Chris, thank you for coming on. We definitely, in the next few weeks, we need to be getting the word out about this. Hopefully there'll be more interviews. Hopefully people I would love for Ben Spiro and Matt Walsh and some of these other what's his name, Charlie Kirk, and some of these others that love this common sense stuff on this. Tucker Carlson and some of these people would actually talk about this case. We need to get this in front of them.
Because take Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire, for example. He works with Ben Shapiro. He's always talking about LGBTQ as inseparably linked to Gnostic dualism, which is another way of saying secular humanism.
Right.
But none of that. But Tucker Carlson, and I love all those guys, they don't have the they don't have the arguments. They don't argue. They just go, "It's bad." And I'm like, "Of course it's bad. What's the solution?" The solution is you weaponize the First Amendment Establishment Clause. You sue people, the government actors. You take them in court under 42 U.S.C. 1983 for violations of the Establishment Clause. You do the analysis about how this stuff is those policies violate the 3 prongs of the limit test. You rely on cases like Torcaso versus Watkins. So what we're doing is we're not just complaining about it. We're using authority to get.
And you're giving an example. This lawsuit is an example, and they need to get you on and discuss it. They should be able to break it down for them. They need to be talking more about this. And so anybody listening to this, again, you can go to Special Forces of Liberty, and you can go to the contact tab there, and you can get a hold of Chris and have him on your program. Let's talk about this. I'm a testimony, but Chris knows the law on this, and this is what needs to happen. This discussion needs to be happening now more than ever before. And this is another reason why we are doing the God's Voice Conference. And if you have not registered for the God's Voice Conference, you need to. We're giving a biblical response to LGBTQ tyranny. And we've got some great speakers like Everett Piper. Quentin Van Meter was there at Johns Hopkins with the whole development of trans medicine, and he knows the science and the medical stuff. And you've got Scott Lively, who was, sued by the Human Rights Campaign, and you've got Denise Schick, who had a transgendered father, and David Pickup, who's in the lawsuit with me, will also be presenting. I mean, just some really great people. All of them are good friends. Reverend Al Baker will be talking about the PCA piece, and just really important. So please register for God's Voice. It's at godsvoice.us. That's May 6th and 7th. And we don't have time to do it, but I do want to mention that I also, in my declaration, mentioned the movie In His Image. It is such a well-done documentary. And then if you go to their website, inhisimage.movie, you can go under the resource tab and look at the videos. And there are a lot of videos underneath there that answer a lot of the questions that people have about the Bible and what is said about LGBTQ issues, the science, education, history, and common questions like, what about going to a gay wedding? And really important stuff. And so we're going to be talking about that also at the God's Voice Conference. And in wrapping up, we have this roll in and roll out music every week. It's Julie Meyer's CD. I love her CDs. She's graciously let me use her song, The Voice of One, which is really an underscoring about it only takes one voice of crying out in the wilderness on her Paint the Picture CD. And that's the roll in and roll out. Why don't you be the voice of one? Why don't you share this video in this interview? Why don't you start proclaiming the truth if you're not already, and help us in this really contending for the faith. And also it is a culture war. And we need to do what's just right. Just like Chris said, his testimony, the reason why he got into this, he just wanted to do what's right, right? And we need to quit being afraid of the LGBTQ, honestly, cult bullies. So I'm your host, Stephen Black. There's another great interview. Thank you, Chris, for being on. And we will be back again here next week on Friday, every morning at 10 a.m. Central, 11 Eastern. Thank you, and God bless you.